Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event on Contracts 101, reviewing common contracts and addressing deal roadblocks. Before we get into today's content, just so we give people a couple minutes to sign on, I'd love to hear from our speakers today, just a little icebreaker so you can get to know them a little bit better. What can we find you doing when you're not sitting at your desk? Natalie, let's start with you.
I think I've got the nerdiest one, so I'll set the bar pretty low here. Many of you are familiar with the craze called Wordle, right? Well, my sister and I have taken it up a notch, and we play something called Quordle, where you're playing 4 Wordle games simultaneously, and you have basically 9 guesses, 9 rows to figure out all 4 at once. So that's the thing that I'm super nerding out about these days.
I love that. That would be way too hard for me to do. Colin, what about you?
Well, as you might see, there's a telescope behind me. So I do like astronomy. I also just frankly enjoy walks and hikes in the outdoors to just disconnect. So those are probably my 2 go-tos.
Lovely. And Brian?
This is a little bit of a cop-out, but right now I don't really have the luxury of time for hobbies because we have a 1 and a 3-year-old at home, 2 daughters. And so every hour I have where I'm not working is dedicated to meeting their various demands. So that's keeping us more than busy right now.
That's a good hobby to have, I would say. All right, cool. Well, let's get into it. So hi, everyone. My name is Gina Holly. I am the community manager at Modern Sales Pros, and my job today is just to welcome this event. So we have some amazing speakers here today to offer their expertise. You're going to get to know them a little bit better after this, but here is a bit about Modern Sales Pros. So if my slide ever changed, there we go. MSP is the world's largest revenue leadership community with 22,000 members from all over the world and counting. It's a community for leaders in sales management, sales and revenue operations, sales development, and the related supporting disciplines. Our mission at Modern Sales Pros is to create an environment for our members to answer the questions that they'd otherwise struggle to solve on their own. So our members engage through live sessions like the one you're about to experience and through our online forum, and in the near future, in-person events. So if you haven't been admitted to MSP yet, you will be admitted shortly. And if you are having trouble, send me a message, gina@modernsaleshq.com. Next up, we wouldn't be able to do this event without the amazing sponsorship from Malbec. So we have Brian here today who is going to introduce Malbec for us. Brian, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Gina, and hello, everyone. Malbec is a modern cloud lifecycle management solution, or CLM for short. I would imagine that many in the audience have been exposed to contract management technology in one way or another. And so you may know the promise is really to bring together the full contract lifecycle under one solution. So everything from contract request to authoring, to negotiation, to execution, all in one best-in-class solution that then allows you to have a single point of review for all of your contracts across the enterprise, which allows you to unlock the power of all that contracting data, whether it's meeting obligations, making sure you're on top of your renewals, and so forth. So we're thrilled to present today, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about what we've learned in this space as we've worked with organizations to automate their contracting processes.
Fantastic. And now it is time to get into our content. So I'm going to hand it off to Natalie, who's our fantastic moderator. If you haven't seen her moderate an event yet, you're in for a treat. Natalie, go ahead and introduce yourself and introduce the other speakers.
Absolutely. Well, welcome, and I'm super excited to be here today. I'm Natalie, former EVP Revenue. For the last 12 years, I've been leading sales and go-to-market teams for US and Israeli-based B2B tech companies. And in that time, I've become a big RevOps enthusiast and a bit of a contract specialist. So I'm excited to be here today. I guess the context for our conversation is this. Closing deals can be complex. We know that. but how can we unpack the complexities in our process in order to close deals faster and speed up those sales cycles? So one common point of friction that a lot of companies experience is the contracting process. And, think about that. That's after sales has already gotten verbal commitments and buy-in from their customers for a deal. So when it's time to put pen to paper and sign a contract, where do things go wrong? Are sales and legal really chasing competing priorities? The goal of our session today is to unpack this idea and figure out how can sales and legal work together effectively to reduce friction in the sales process and create smoother, faster wins. And to do so, we'll hear from experts in the field, Brian and Colin, who will introduce themselves in just a second. Some of the topics that we'll be covering today include, overview on some common contract types and their purpose, the processes and tools needed to unite sales and legal around contract management, the role of RevOps and enablement, and how to avoid some of those common deal roadblocks or deal killers, as we'll talk about them. And so with that, I'd love to have our panel introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Brian, since you've already heard a bit from him?
Sure. Thanks, Natalie. Hi again. I'm an account executive at Malbec, focusing on the large enterprise segment here. In terms of my background, I have about 10 years as a quota-carrying seller, working in a number of different contexts. So I've worked in SaaS implementation sales, had a long stint in consulting, research, and advisory sales at Gartner, and now I'm with Malbec, of course, focusing on SaaS technology sales in a startup context. So thrilled to be here. The commonality across all those experiences is contracting and the pains associated with it. So I'll be providing a little bit of personal background on my story, also some perspective on what we've been seeing from the hundreds of organizations we're working with on this challenge.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And Colin.
Thanks very much, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Director of Legal for Malbec and Evangelist. I am their one-person legal department, not a role I've had before in my over a decade of experience of in-house counsel work, where I have been breathing, living contracts for all that time. So I definitely know a lot of the pain points that have been experienced and how to resolve them and work through them. And I also am a frequent speaker and writer about legal technology, particularly around contracts, but also in other areas as well, and how technology can be a great benefit to making contracting an easier and faster and more empowering process for the various functions involved. So I look forward to diving into that topic a little bit more during this session.
Perfect. Well, I'm super excited. Why don't we kind of ease into it? Let's get the lay of the land as you both see it. What is the current state of contracting from your perspective, kind of legal and sales respectively? Kind of what are you seeing and where are those challenges really standing out for you? Who wants to jump in? I'll let this one be a free-for-all.
Colin, I'll give you, I might be tough on you today, Colin, as the proxy for legal, so I will let you go first.
That's perfectly fine. I'm very used to being in that position. As from my perspective, I think that, contracting remains a very intense, very oftentimes painful process in some ways, but I think it's been getting better, partly due to technology's ability to make contracting a more data-driven, more strategic-driven process, and also the one that tends to be more cross-functional. But at the same time, I think that there is increased pressure to do more with less, as there always is. In other words, we're not adding more resources, but we're adding more work, and we expect you to continue to keep up and continue to move things along and not necessarily stand in the way of getting things done. So there's this balance, I think, at least in terms of the legal function, to continue to meet the needs of the business while also, frankly, doing your job and protecting the business against kind of itself in some ways from taking on unnecessary risk. So I think that balance remains something that's very key and critical, and technology certainly is playing a bigger role in meeting the challenge of finding that balance.
So I'll jump in from the seller's perspective, and I'll start by saying that over the last 10 years, in my experience, the resources, the processes, the tools that are available to sellers, it's remarkable how much improvement there's been in that time. So that is thanks in no small part to the folks who are on the line today from RevOps, from Sales Ops, sales leadership. But I would say that contracting is an area that has been really stubborn in terms of driving improvement. From a seller's perspective, it's probably one of the more vulnerable moments across the course of a year. And it depends on what you're selling. But if you're selling complex sales to executives, complex solutions, it's the 1 yard line, as Natalie mentioned. You've worked diligently to strategically execute a sales cycle across many stakeholders across a customer organization. And now you have this final task to complete. And for many sellers, it's still incredibly slow. The process of contracting lacks transparency. So oftentimes you are sending a request over a wall and maybe there's a deal desk standing in your way. Maybe there's a legal inbox, but oftentimes you have no idea what's happening or why. And as somebody who's worked very hard to build a strategic relationship with your customer, that's an unusual position to be in. Because for many organizations, they've aligned solution consultants, professional services, resources around the company to help you drive revenue, to drive business outcomes. And it feels oftentimes like the legal and contracting process is disconnected from that. So from my point of view, it's absolutely an area of opportunity. And it's one that is both an opportunity for speeding up time to revenue, but also if you think about seller engagement and retention, this is really important stuff. These are moments that matter for your sellers. And if we don't get this right and enable them, you're going to find that competitors who can get this right, I think, are going to be attracting some of the top talent.
Wow. Super well articulated, both of you. I think you highlight kind of these different perspectives really well as kind of where sales and legal respectively are coming from. I think as a level set for the conversation, we promised that we would do a bit of a contracts 101 overview. And so I'd love to kind of take a sidestep from the hot topics that we will continue to talk about and maybe just offer this kind of basics. Colin, let's defer to your expertise here. Can you give us kind of the three kind of most common contracts that you'll see during the deal cycle and just kind of a quick overview on what they are and what their purpose is?
Absolutely. So first of all, there's always the non-disclosure agreement, basically an agreement where both parties agree to not disclose confidential information that is being shared between the two of them outside of the context of a potential deal. These often do get negotiated a little bit. My personal view is that they shouldn't really be negotiated that much. There should just be one standard agreement and you just sign it because it's as simple as basically you don't share any secrets. I won't share any secrets. Good. So that's sort of the basic agreement that needs to be put in place, ideally before a more detailed conversation is started between the two parties discussing sort of potential pricing, potential implementation, sort of details of the service that is being contemplated to be purchased. Following that, assuming that the parties can kind of agree on the outlines of a deal, there's usually a master service agreement. It's called various things by the various companies, but ultimately it is the one contract that sets out the terms of the entire relationship between the two parties and outlines who's responsible for things going right and going wrong and how much does someone have to pay at what time and for what, and when can I call for support? When will that support be provided? Sort of basic things like that. Those tend to get heavily negotiated because there's obviously a lot of risk involved often in these deals, and you want to make sure that that risk is allocated properly, at least from a legal perspective, between the two parties. In addition, there are amendments, which are basically just documents that modify the terms of an existing deal. And often that can cover anything so much as extending a term to extending pricing, perhaps adding on additional services or even removing services, what have you. And oftentimes you need that in place because two parties may say, yeah, all right, you know what, I want to do something a little bit differently here. Well, that's all well and good, but you need to get that in writing to make sure both parties are obligated to do what they say they're going to do. And that's the purpose of an amendment. So those are kind of the three basic types of agreements. There are variations of those three, but typically those are the three that make up a deal overall.
Got it. So we've got the NDA, the MSA, and amendments. I guess, Brian, that was obviously a very comprehensive explanation and fair, but is there anything you want to add from like a frontline seller's perspective just to help put this in a bit more context?
Sure. I was doing some rapid word association as Colin was talking there, so I took some notes. NDA, I wrote down bane of a seller's existence. And that might be a little bit dramatic, but to Colin's point, it is a necessary step in the process, but can often slow down progress from a seller's perspective, not adding any value to the sales cycle. So for us, when we find organizations that have manual NDA processes, when they have organizations that are relying on legal inboxes in order to get NDAs done, that's a miss that's going to slow down sales cycles and hurt morale, because it's increasingly becoming table stakes. So finding a way to automate that through a modern solution is something that's really the lowest of low-hanging fruit when we talk about this notion of CLM. I got a few more notes, Natalie, so I'll be quick though.
Go for it.
MSA or revenue agreements, I mean, that's sort of where the rubber meets the road in terms of this discussion. That's where legal and sales really need to partner closely. Colin does not want me commenting on limitation of liability, nor do I want him negotiating my legal or my commercial terms rather. So that's where we really need to work together. And it's a challenge because we have different priorities, but a modern solution that can bring together collaboration capabilities, smart direction around who's going to be responsible for what can be really valuable. And I'm sure we'll talk more about the promise and what that's looking for businesses soon. And then finally, amendments. From my perspective, that's where you need a single source of truth for contracts. I've had many roles in the past where I've spent hours upon hours searching through databases to look up old amendments. I've been pinging people who used to have my job, say, hey, do you have this contract? And I've been doing manual reviews across all of them just to figure out what we've agreed to and where we are. That is time that is not spent well for sellers because they are not selling when they're doing that. They're doing admin work. So again, there's solutions that can solve that problem. But the more you can put tools into the hands of your sellers as well as your legal team to kind of fulfill their end of the bargain, I think the better off you'll be. So that's a big pain point we see as well.
Yeah, I'm just reminded as you were speaking, I was reminded of a nice experience where after that kind of process of due diligence and searching for the right kind of the latest version of the amendment between us and a client, we found it, and then the client found a later version. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, not a great document management process there. Okay, so we just got kind of the contract overview again from like the technical legal perspective and also from the give me the down low from a sales perspective, but we know the devil is in the details, especially when it comes to legal documents. So I'm curious to get your take. How familiar should each frontline seller in the organization actually be with their company's contracts, with the terms and conditions that it entails, and to what level of depth and understanding? So Colin, what's your take on that?
Sure. So, my take in general is I want the sales team to understand my role, understand how to work with me, understand what I do. I'll be perfectly honest with them. I'm not a magician. What I do is not magic tricks behind some curtain. There's nothing magical about what I do except, I suppose, helping deals get done, which is magical for everyone. So to that end, whenever I'm joining a new organization and working with sales, one of the first things I want to do is I want to set up meetings with all the key sales leaders, as well as the broader sales team as a whole, to introduce myself, to introduce kind of how I work and get to know them and how they work and how I can best meet the needs of what they're trying to do and how they're working. Because I really think there needs to be alignment on that in order for there to be an effective process in place for doing contracts. In addition, with respect to understanding the basic contracts themselves, I absolutely want the sales team to understand some of the basic terms of the agreement. They don't need to be an expert. That's my job. But I do want them to understand why I do some of the things that I do and why I talk about some of the clauses that I do and why they're important. And that's for two reasons. Number one, I want them to understand kind of where I'm coming from so that it's not a surprise to them when it comes up during a discussion. And two, so that perhaps if they can get familiar with these templates, I can empower them to negotiate a little bit without needing to come to me. That's the other part of it. And that I think can really facilitate a faster deal cycle, is empowering the sales team to do a little bit more and be able to negotiate some of the stuff without waiting on me or whomever to say, yeah, okay, we can do this, or no, we can't do that. And so I really think that's part of sort of an initial training process that can be really important and valuable, I think, for sales teams and working with legal and building sort of a trust and a strong working relationship between the two.
I think that's the best case scenario that I would certainly hope for. Curious if there's any horror stories, though, that you've encountered when it comes to like empowering the sellers and explaining where you're coming from. Have you ever had that kind of come back to bite you?
I absolutely have, yes. And in some cases, to be honest, in some cases, it's the part of the seller, I think, being a little too smart for their own good, meaning that they think they know something that they may not. Or perhaps they think that they can go ahead and negotiate something else, even though I told them they can only negotiate X, Y, and Z. So yes, there was an occasion where a seller did end up negotiating a liability provision that they should not have been negotiating, at least to the extent to which they negotiated. And we ended up having to agree to something that really we should not have agreed to, but we couldn't really go back on what had been promised already because we were pretty far along in the deal process. And this was an important customer that was going to refer us to other companies as well. So we kind of wanted to build a good relationship with them and couldn't go back on this. So it was a little bit unfortunate, but I think that was a result of just unclear expectations and not clearly communicating what exactly you could negotiate and to what extent, and then when you needed me or someone else's approval to move ahead. And so that's where I think clear communication comes into play, as well as just simply checking in on the team and saying, hey, how are you doing? Do you have any questions about kind of what I have said you can do or can't do, and kind of just making sure that you're always aligned, because things change quickly in an evolving organization, particularly as deals grow in size and complexity.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Brian, what's your take on this? Kind of what's been your experience at the different roles that you've had? What's been the expectation in terms of your, how much depth of knowledge you've needed to have on the contracts? And, what do you think, if there's value in that, what do you think is the value in actually being able to kind of take control of your sale? You talked about it earlier, that sellers are very used to kind of having kind of this quarterback mentality throughout most of that sales cycle and being able to corral the team around getting the revenue outcomes. What's been your experience around, if there's any correlation of sellers who tend to know their contracts more deeply and their ability to drive the deal forward?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and if I reflect back on all of my sales training over the last 10 years, I've never been trained in contract details.
Oh, really?
Colin is changing that here at Malbec, but in past roles, it's long been sort of an odd gap. I've been workshopped on cold calling, prospecting skills, negotiation for commercial terms, but the contract piece has always just been an odd black hole where issues are sort of dealt on a one-off basis, or legal teams have sort of handled it separately. And I think that's what we see a lot of, sort of a decoupling of commercial and legal terms at organizations. And it's done with the best intentions, because legal teams are overwhelmed, as Colin mentioned. They want to be efficient. But what happens in practice, I think, in a lot of organizations is I'm negotiating commercials and I get beat up and give probably some suboptimal concessions on the commercial side. Colin, as our proxy for legal here, this wouldn't happen at Malbec, but at other organizations I've worked at, he would separately negotiate legal T's and C's. He'd say, hey, don't worry, Brian, I got it. I'll work with the counterparty directly. You actually don't even need to be on the emails. That's happened at companies I've been at. Just say, don't worry, Brian, we'll figure it out. That's always comforting for a seller who's trying to close a deal before year end. That's going to determine if they hit quota or not. And so I've seen that decoupling, and I think it's a miss, because obviously everything in a contract can be negotiated. And if they're being negotiated in silos, you miss the opportunity to leverage those concessions for better commercial terms. So sellers are very used to being able to say, well, okay, you have issues with that limitation of liability language. Why does that matter to you? Okay, got it. And then if I go back to the team and I talk to Colin and we can find a way to be flexible, would you be able to do X, whatever matters to you most? That's something that sellers do all day, every day. So I think there's a real opportunity to combine these and to really show sellers what are the key clauses and terms that are most often negotiated. And that's data you can get from a modern CLM solution like Malbec. And then you can enable them by saying, hey, this is what the range of solutions look like. This is what your floor is. This is what your best case scenario is. Give us a little bit of power to quarterback that, as you said, and then I can work in turn with Colin. The same way I go back to finance to get payment term extensions approved and so forth. It should really just be an extension of that model. And for a lot of reasons, it's kind of sat outside of that normal seller's process. I think there's a real opportunity to pull it back in.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just jump in and just say that I think, the reason why I think that, Brian, you've experienced that kind of walling up over time is because for a long time, legal function kind of has viewed itself as protection, as needing to protect itself, and as needing to wall itself off from other parts of the business. And unfortunately, that's led to misalignment on goals, on negotiations, and really kind of, as you said, this creation of a black hole in terms of legal. Whereas, I view legal terms as also being business terms. In other words, any legal decision is also a business decision. So they should be part of the same negotiation. And I want the sales team to understand kind of where our positions are, where our fallback positions are, what compromise language we can have in place. And a modern CLM solution can offer that right off the bat from having a built-in playbook, essentially, where sales teams can turn to and say, all right, well, I see, they're pushing back on this. Well, all right, I can use this instead. And that's a way to speed up the cycle and not have to go to me, and they can feel empowered to make that kind of call on their own because they know what they're sort of empowered to come back with. And also, quite frankly, I want to be on the same page with sales. So I always want to be constantly communicating with them and understand kind of where things stand, both on the business end and overall, and how I can help contribute to move things along. Because again, I've got nothing to hide. I'm not a magician. I'm not trying to be. That's not my role. My role is to be a collaborator.
Absolutely. I'll just add to that as well. I think there's a lot to be learned from about your clients, about your customers and their sensitivities by having some legal fluency. In other words, it's not just about what we as a company care about and what our position is and what our interests are and what we're going to protect. If you can understand, third-party paperwork that's been sent over to you and you can see they've taken a really harsh stance on X or Y, that helps you understand something about where that company places their own emphasis and priorities. And that's, I think, really important information for the seller to have so that they can also communicate that through to the rest of the fulfillment team that is ultimately going to be working day in and day out with the customers. One thing I just wanted to call out, we have a really active Q&A going on. So thank you for that. I think that's really exciting, though I'm going to preempt some questions that seem to be asking Colin for legal advice. And, we can read maybe those questions out, and Colin, you might kind of find the line as to where you're comfortable and not comfortable. But I think for the purpose of making this a really effective Q&A, let's try and focus the conversation on kind of that approach between sales, legal, and how we can kind of empower sales and legal to work together effectively to drive revenue outcomes, more so than any specific legal advice on how you've structured your contracts. I think that might need to be taken offline, or check in with a legal advisor. And we'll see, I think, as we get into this next portion of our discussion, I think we'll start to address some of these other Q&A questions that have come in. So if you guys are okay, let's keep it moving. I would love to hear if there's any kind of common deal killers that you've encountered, any kind of common roadblocks that come up, and how you have avoided them or how you suggest to avoid them. Brian, why don't we start with you?
Sure. And I know I mentioned, Colin, I was going to be tough on you. I'll admit I've never had a deal be killed by a lawyer. So no murder charges today. But I've had deals be delayed, and I've had peers, one comes to mind in particular, who, because of a legal delay, missed out on a quarter close that would have led to a pretty significant spiff for him, a meaningful bonus that mattered to him at sort of a critical moment of the pandemic. And there's a legal delay and he missed it. The deal closed, but he missed out on the bonus. And I can tell you, he doesn't work at that company anymore because he's getting so much pressure to sell, so much pressure to perform, but he didn't feel like they had the processes or support that was needed to support him. So I think the opportunity here is a couplefold. First, I'm sure there's examples of deals being killed, but more so it's delaying deals, it's rep engagement, rep retention. But to the extent that deals could be killed, to me, it's more about the culture of the organization. There's not one clause, not one term that is delaying or killing deals. Rather, it is this divorcing of business reality from legal discussion. So often we see agreements, and I'll admit it's usually vendor paper that we're compelled to take, and it's a 20-year-old on-premise application agreement. And so all of a sudden we have attorneys, and I'm speaking across 10 years, who have sort of been obliged to have these really arcane discussions about topics that don't even apply to the service that we're offering. And so the more we can be aligned with legal as sellers to understand what's actually happening, what's the business outcome we're driving towards, what's the relationship we're envisioning, so that we can kind of push back, get through all of that noise to get to the core of what's needed, I think the better off we will be. But that's where I see the biggest pain, the delays and the experience of the reps rather than killing it.
Mm-hmm. Colin, anything that you want to call out?
Yeah, I think certainly there is, in my experience, oftentimes, particularly when you're dealing with SaaS, but also any kind of I'd say even more cutting edge technology, oftentimes, particularly when dealing with a larger company, you'll get their paper, and as Brian mentioned, it will not be applicable, or at least most of the terms won't be applicable. So then you kind of have to spend time educating the client and the lawyer and kind of, yeah, so, we got your paper, we appreciate it, but, we're kind of not really aligned in terms of what the actual terms of this deal are going to be, because, we're talking about on-premise and all this other stuff, and we're working in the cloud, what have you. So that can certainly slow deals down. I would say I've seen less of that over the last few years than before, but that still exists. I think also there is kind of just this tendency for lawyers to be lawyers, meaning there's a tendency for lawyers to always want to comment on everything and always make edits regardless of whether they're substantive or not. And look, I get it. We all have jobs. We need to sometimes justify having our jobs sometimes. I understand that. But at the end of the day, if you don't like how something is worded, just simply because you don't like how it's worded, but it doesn't really make a bit of difference substantively as to whether it's worded one way or another, I'm not going to be bothered with changing that. Just, there's no point. If it means the same thing and you're getting to the same result, if there's a couple added words here or there, it's not really worth it. And plus, you would much rather be spending your time negotiating on something that is worth it and riskier. So, I think kind of understanding where you want to push back and where to fight your battles, I think is something that's very important. And if you're fighting over every single thing, that can definitely kill a deal and slow it down. Not to mention, it can also kind of lead to, I'd say, the creation of sort of some negativity between the parties because they're just fighting you on every single thing, and you're really trying to work with them. They're always coming back super aggressively. So there's that. And then the last thing I would mention is, when you're doing red lines or you're making any kind of edits to an agreement, regardless of what they are, my goal is to explain why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I want to put a comment in there just saying, not, no, we can't agree to this, but rather, all right, I understand where you're coming from. Here's where our position is. Let's see if we can come together and make this work here. Because I always think that adding comments to explain is always better than not. And that's a way, I think, to facilitate a faster deal cycle. And also, frankly, help the other side understand why the edits are being made, especially if you got someone who isn't a legal person looking at those edits and trying to figure out, I don't really understand what this means. Why is this changed? A comment can go a long way towards helping clarifying that, those types of things.
That's a great tip. I think also in this little bit, we've talked a lot about kind of where things go wrong, why things get stuck, what are kind of the common pitfalls. But of course, it's not all bad, and there are some great solutions out there to explore. So let's kind of get actionable and start to think in solutions here and make sure that our audience can walk away with some great takeaways. So again, the backdrop here is how can we empower sales and legals to work collaboratively to essentially drive faster deal cycles? And I'm curious if you guys can describe for us, what does good look like? What are the tools and processes that can be helpful at this point in the sales cycle? And as part of some of your answers, I may pop in some of the Q&As as well. But Brian, can you describe for us, what does good look like?
Sure. And this is going to vary so much based on context. In looking at the comments, I see there's organizations with one-person legal teams. I also see there's kind of global, large enterprise organizations represented. So the challenges and solutions will be different based on context. But I'm reminded of one of our customers, a software company in the Bay Area, and they undertook this challenge. They had sort of a series of really fragmented processes, a series of different technology solutions. There was an approval engine that was a mess. They had a contract repository, sort of an intake engine. Nothing was connected. It was a bad user experience, very hard to get data out of it. And so they undertook this change management process, and they happen to be using Malbec, but there's lots of different solutions that would fulfill potentially a similar need. And what they're able to do was be really relentless about determining what agreements can we automate? What can we put in the hands of sellers, give them guardrails and say, you know what, you can go out and you can take this NDA. If the counterparty has comments, here's what we can agree to. If it breaches any of these, then it can get routed to legal. And they were able to do that with a wide range of agreements, really trusting their sales team to keep the best interests of the company in mind within the guardrails that they provided. And so for them, the legal team, when they're at legal conferences, they talk about how they went from touching 80% of contracts, so highly paid attorneys marking up NDAs, marking up every agreement you can imagine, which led to, of course, huge delays, sales cycle delays, to going to only touching 20%. And that meant that they were then touching only the most critical negotiations. They were able to really partner with the business and double down on being by their side in those important negotiations, and then trusted the sales team to enable everything else. And so I'd say that's one example of what good looks like. To put it in more broad terms, the more that the folks who are on this call can get involved in this discussion, I'd say the better. A lot of the legal organizations we work with are under a lot of pressure to transform. They've been a laggard across the enterprise in terms of adopting technology, leveraging data. And so they're being asked to change, and contracts is one of the lowest hanging areas of opportunity for them because it's one of the areas where they spend the most money. They have the most headcount committed to contract management. So legal is talking right now about transformation. They're thinking about contract management technology. And a lot of the organizations we work with, they say, we're going to get a solution in place. We're going to get comfortable with it, and then we'll talk to sales. We'll bring them on then. And I don't want to discourage organizations from being thoughtful about sequencing change, but if you take that approach, the seller perspective isn't going to be captured in that evaluation process. Maybe it's your procurement function that's leading the charge, and before you know it, you have a solution that's not fit for purpose. So you want to make sure that you're first part of that discussion, and then you can start to bring all the lessons learned and capabilities that you've developed over the last 10 years, enterprise technology deployment skills, data management, understanding how to manage change across applications in an enterprise setting. And you can bring that to your legal, your procurement teams, and help them navigate that journey, because those aren't muscles that they've built to the same degree. So I'd very much encourage everyone to be part of the dialogue, and you can start to achieve, I believe, some of those outcomes that I mentioned before.
Colin, what does good look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would just say that I think something that Brian kind of alluded to with his insightful remarks is a theme that I tend to speak a lot about, which is people, process, then tech. You want to understand where your people are working from, why they're working the way they are, what incentives they have to work that way, what processes you have in place, if any, what those look like, where the pain points are, and then use that information then to inform what types of tools you should be looking at, what types of programs you should be looking at to empower these functions, to speed up the deal cycle, and so on. But if you skip those two steps and just go right to sort of a shiny key, you're essentially going to just highlight the existing problems you have, because tech is only as good as what you have in place. Tech cannot sort of just magically work. It works off of data, it works off process, it works off of people. And so you really need to start with those two things first. And I understand that's time intensive. I understand it's not really all that glamorous. But if you skip over those steps, you're going to be in a world of hurt and have very expensive software sitting on a shelf somewhere, as opposed to understanding sort of the lay of the land, where you would like to be, what does good look like for you in the context of how you work and how your organization works, and what types of tools kind of fit into that process and your existing tools as well, because you want a new tool to fit into your existing tech stack, meaning your existing set of tools. You don't want a new tool to all of a sudden, require investing in a whole bunch of other tools because this one doesn't work with your existing tools. So that's sort of, some of the groundwork you need to, I think, begin with before you move along forward. And the other thing I think that kind of good looks like is having in place sort of a set standard workflow that everyone understands, everyone feels a part of, and everyone feels like they have a say in. As Brian alluded to, you really want to make sure that every single function that's a part of the contracting process has a say in what that process looks like and why it will look like what it should look like. And that means talking to revenue people, talking to finance people, talking to sales, talking to legal, whomever. It's really sort of a collaborative process. And I think for too long, contracting was really seen as the domain of legal. And that's really not what reality is on the ground. It's really a lot of different functions coming together to get a deal done. Legal is but one part of it. Certainly an important part, but not the only important part and not the biggest part sometimes. So, you really want to make sure that you have all these different functions aligned in the process and have the right tools to make the process be as best as it can be.
I think that's a great segue for one of the questions that came out of our Q&A. So, are you ready? Okay. The question from Derek. We're constantly running into approval errors in routing, delegation, inform versus approve, et cetera, as well as the need to update and change approvals, the need for more flexibility around that approval, I guess, structure. How does Malbec, or how did the two of you consider the approval flow as part of the contracting process? And are there benefits to a single application for contracting versus multi? In this case, the person who asked is using CPQ and Aptus. Any initial thoughts on that? Yep.
I'll start. So I think Colin really correctly mentioned people, process, and technology. And I'd say for a lot of the organizations that we work with, even though the symptoms of approval issues are the kinds of things that Derek is mentioning, hey, it's painful to change them, they're misfiring all the time, the root cause is actually a process problem. When we sit down with organizations, we start talking about configuring their Malbec solution and thinking about approval workflows. We have them map out what that looks like. And the complexity that they come back with is unbelievable. And they surprise themselves when they actually put it on paper. They say, I can't believe we've been doing this. And it's been built up over time. I'm sure a lot of the organizations that are on here have grown very quickly, and it's been sort of additive. And so, I'd say for a lot of the organizations we work with, starting with a process mindset is the right place. And if you can rationalize why specific approvals are needed, then absolutely, then it moves to technology. But I'd absolutely start there, because I think there's so many decisions that are made with the best intention. And I know from the sales side, we see this with incentive plans. I have a friend in sales ops, and they have some really exciting spiff programs. Bonuses are always changing, credits are flying around. And at the end of the day, it's impossible for them to actually track who sold what and what credit that they're getting. And they can't even keep track of who's going to President's Club. It's a mess. And it's made with the best intentions. But the root cause is that they made decisions that weren't based on what's practical, and they have to pay with that, deal with that pain down the line. So I'd say we'd start there. But typically, just sort of from a nuts and bolts perspective, we absolutely see organizations using CPQ for any of their approvals related to product, price, et cetera. And those tools make a lot of sense for managing that. But then when it comes to downstream legal or kind of more broad commercial discussions, that's where the approval workflow for CLM comes into play. Colin, did I leave you any meat on the bone there? I got excited about it there, so I'm sorry if I...
No, I agree with everything you've said. What I would add is I think, sometimes there is pressure to make sure you have the right approvals in place to ensure that, you're following along with applicable laws or policies or what have you. But I think sometimes what happens is you get caught up in kind of waiting for approvals, and that something is going to get approved, but you just have to get this person to sign off on it. And I think what oftentimes you can do to sort of get around that and make it faster is just having in place a playbook where you kind of just know, all right, this is always going to be approved, and therefore you don't have to seek someone's approval because it's already been pre-approved. So I think kind of having these pre-approvals in place and a playbook that you can go to for sort of fallback language and certain types of language and concessions that are pre-approved can kind of speed up that process without needing to wait for an approval. But again, you need to kind of map things out, as Brian mentioned. And sometimes that means literally drawing things out on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard to understand how things are flowing. And then you can kind of see how perhaps convoluted or complex something has gotten, not intentionally, but just because of things growing and people being added and things being changed. And then you can see where you can kind of speed things up or short circuit things a little bit.
That's super helpful. We have another question here that I think takes us even earlier. And I think I'll add a little bit to the question. It's how can you build this in the first case without creating all of that complexity? So the question specifically asks, is there any advice on implementing a contracting software like DocuSign, PandaDoc, Malbec, etc., with a CRM? I'm about to embark on that at the startup where I'm the sales operations lead and we have a legal department of one. So you guys have already called out this idea of like mapping the process, doing that work kind of offline and regardless of the tool that you're using. But what else could you offer by way of advice?
Colin, if you want to go first this time, happy to, or I could jump in.
Sure. So I've been in that position before at a startup where I've been the only legal person and put in place a process. And so I think you kind of want to look at sort of the reality right now, but also look ahead to how you anticipate the organization growing and in doing so, kind of built in a process that has some degree of flexibility. I mean, it's not just set in stone, but it has some ability to grow and maneuver and be adaptable, assuming you add in additional heads or what have you to the process. So I think you start with kind of, all right, but right now, I approve, I review, then it's sent off for sign off to whomever. But then, we're going to maybe have an ops person or whomever come in. Do we want them to kind of review things and kind of map things out, I think, in terms of how things potentially will grow, document that process, and then have that in mind with respect to whatever tools you're looking at and understand, okay, well, we don't need all this functionality right now, so that's fine. But does it have this additional functionality we likely will need down the road? And if so, all right, well, that's great. Let's sign up for this. And we don't need this functionality right now, but we're likely going to need it down the road. So we can add that on at that future point. In addition, you want to look at, okay, what tools do we use in addition to this potential contract management tool? Or, do we use Salesforce or using HubSpot? What kind of other tools are we using? Does this tool integrate with those tools? And if so, that's great. That means that there's a constant data flow and there's no kind of blockage of data between these different tools. And that's important, especially as you grow, because there's more and more data, more and more complexity, and you want everything to stay automatically updated. You not have to manually transfer data from one place to another, which is just going to open yourself up to potential errors and creating a mess and reduce, I would say, the benefits you would gain from having a contract management solution in place.
Colin, you took the words out of my mouth in terms of starting with the future in mind. We often find that organizations set out on this journey to solve sort of the problem of the day. I'm reminded of one organization we've been working with where they're in the middle of a complex negotiation, multiple rounds of edits back and forth, a manual process, and they ended up sending back red lines on version 6 when they're actually on version 12. The counterparty, who happened to be one of the biggest clients of the entire company, didn't go back to the sales rep and the attorney supporting the negotiation. They went to the CFO. And they said, what kind of organization are you running here? This is a joke. And so right away, the problem that the CFO said, I need you to solve tomorrow is I need a repository for all of our contracts so we have line of sight. And that is a well-intentioned idea, but the root cause, the real problem was that they didn't have a process in place to really put their arms around how negotiations were being completed and feeding that into a repository in the back end. So great, you put a repository in place, but a year and a half later, you find that all of the agreements that were being executed outside the system, still being done manually, are not living in that repository. So your goal of having line of sight isn't going to be completed. So taking a much broader view, as Colin mentioned, is one that is ultimately going to make you look better in 5 years when you go through explosive growth in your company. And you were the one that had the vision to pull in legal, to pull in procurement. I think it's a big part of thinking about keeping the future in mind, getting everyone at the table, because this is different from CRM in some respects, certainly different from HR or finance technology in that the promise, but the challenge of this endeavor is that everyone's involved. You don't have the luxury of creating a solution by yourself just with input from your team. You need to bring everyone together. So I'd absolutely say, even if it's a team of one in legal, get them involved. If there's procurement reps, get them involved. If there's finance, get them involved. And your main use case very well is likely sales enablement, making sure that you have a great integration with your CRM, which is so important. But if you have their buy-in, that's going to mean it's going to be success, not just this year, but 5 years in the future.
Thanks. I'm going to tee up one additional Q&A, and then we'll kind of get back to our regularly scheduled programming and help wrap up the session. But earlier we talked about this idea of needing to choose the tool in mind with thinking about all the stakeholders, all the potential end users, and what that user experience is going to be like for each of them. The question that's been asked by Cliff is, I've never met a lawyer who wants to do red lines outside of Microsoft Word, and therefore they never want to use software to manage contracts, as they always prefer email and Word. That by far has been the biggest hurdle for a CLM. How do you manage that?
Brian, I'll let you go ahead and speak to it, and then I'll add in as necessary.
Because you're sort of you're accused here. I think Cliff is right. There's no question about it that. For a lot of attorneys, particularly if you're, working in more established kind of blue chip settings, they want that Word doc. That's how they've come up through the ranks negotiating agreements. And so, for all the sales ops and rev ops people, they can probably close their eyes and imagine sales-driven contract solutions from yesteryear that would bring counterparties onto a platform to facilitate negotiation, which everyone hated. Nobody wants to get onto a new platform to go through end user training just to negotiate an agreement, which is something they've been doing for 10, 20 years. So Malbec's approach, and I think we're seeing more of this in the space overall, is if there's tools that have solved a problem well, we're incorporating that into our end user experience. So for us, we have, I think, a fairly unique Word plugin that allows teams to negotiate, collaborate, work together online in our tool. But then if you want to send out a Word doc from the system directly to your counterparty so they have that comfort of having the Word doc in front of them, absolutely. They send that right back. It's ingested by the system, and you can collaborate again as a team. So that's the approach that we've taken. But I'd say if the goal, and so many modern companies are saying we don't need Word, but the problem is your counterparties do. And so if the notion is that you're going to fight against that and show them another way, given all the vendors you're likely working with, all the people you're going to be selling to, I think that's a tall ask. So meeting them where they are is probably a better solution, and that's kind of the tack we've taken.
Yeah, so I would add on top of that, I use Word all the time for a lot of different writings. However, the beauty of Malbec's system is I can work in Word, but then automatically update the system with the document, including the comments, including the red lines, what have you. And the system treats it and treats it well. And you can clearly see within the system all these red lines and comments. So there's no need to kind of have to worry about formatting or whatever getting messed up when you're working Word and then working with this additional system. It's seamless between the two. And I totally understand where Cliff is coming from. Lawyers do love tradition, and they love the tools that they know and have grown up with, which is certainly Word in many cases. And Word is great sometimes, not always. But if that's what you're working with, there's no need to necessarily fight against that. There's ways to simply just improve what you're doing through the use of a CLM system that integrates with Word and allows for you to work within a system you recognize, but also a system you don't, without necessarily having to go through the steep learning curve of learning a new tool and then kind of slowing down and then being accused of getting in the way of a deal or slowing things down or what have you. So I really think that sort of this integration with Word and this solution is a great approach. It's one that I have taken to, I joined Malbec. I never used this tool before joining the company. It took me just a matter of days to get up to speed, and I'm great. I'm tech savvy in some ways and tech savvy and not so tech savvy in other ways. So it really wasn't that big a deal. And anyone of any background, I think, will be able to pick things up pretty quickly because it's just that seamless and that clean of an interface and pretty intuitive. And I get it. It's sometimes when it comes to lawyers, you feel like you're fighting City Hall. In other words, there's no way to win. So rather than engaging in that kind of, battle, just work with what you have and just try to make what you have better. And that, I think, is really the approach that Malbec is taking with regards to Word in managing contracts.
Thank you both. There's a few more questions, and I think we're unfortunately not going to have time to answer them right here. So I want to ask if people have kind of follow-up questions and they want to continue the conversation with you directly, Brian and Colin, what's the best way for people to get in touch?
Go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, I'm not familiar with this functionality, but I see a big blue circle at the top of the screen. Request a demo with your sponsor. That would be a great way to contact us. And even if it's not a demo per se, if there's just more of a high-level conversation, Colin and I are often, along with our team, working with folks to think about the broader change journey. So we'd be happy to connect with anyone who's interested through that mechanism.
Right, absolutely. So certainly that's one way. I'm also very active on LinkedIn and also Twitter, so you can find me on both of those platforms. On LinkedIn, it's just under my name, and on Twitter, it's @CLevy_law. I'm not shy about sharing my opinion about this space. So feel free to connect with me there. But certainly, I think the best way in terms of learning about Malbec would be to click that button, requesting a demo with us.
Perfect. So as we wrap up here, I want to see if you can leave our audience with maybe one or two final thoughts. If there's kind of a key takeaway that you could boil down to one or two main points, what would you hope our audience take away from this session? And maybe specifically, if, I think we have a lot of RevOps and enablement leaders who have shown up today, what role can they particularly play in bridging some of the gaps that we've discussed. Brian, you have your thoughts together?
Sure, it's a long discussion to be sure. I would say again that there's a real role for this community to play in these projects, and for some of the earlier stage companies, where there is that one person legal team. I think it's sort of inherent that sales ops, rev ops are at the table for these discussions, but for slightly larger organizations, that's really often not the case at all. So I would very much encourage the team to kind of think about contracting as part of its central mission in the same way that you would, territory management or sales enablement. This is as much of a part of the seller's journey as any one of those elements. So I'd say there's a big role to play. And the good news is you've got the skills already. You've done this work thinking about process design, the customer journey. You've already built the technology and data skills that would be needed to address this problem. So I'd say really start to engage with your legal and procurement teams if appropriate. See where they are on this journey, because they're likely already taking demos. They're likely already thinking about this, and make sure that seller perspective is represented. And then finally, again, almost that first principles mindset we sort of alluded to, making sure that all of the processes and components that have sort of been built up over time still make sense for the goals that you have. I know we're not providing legal advice, but there's a question about, hey, listen, what if we got rid of a certain kind of agreement and just streamlined it into one? That sounds, from a seller's perspective, that sounds pretty smart to me. To think, hey, if we're talking about our go-to-market strategy, we're talking about how we're structuring our deals and packages, shouldn't we also be thinking about how we actually execute these things? Are our contracts fit for purpose? Do we have alignment with legal so that we're all aligned across the same goal? So I'd say start the conversations now. The things that need to be addressed will probably present themselves quickly, and I really believe that more than ever, there's a need for Rev and Sales Ops to step in and kind of start addressing some of these.
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. I would just add that I think, as I mentioned before, got to put in the hard work first. You gotta get a lay of the land. You have to understand where people are coming from, how they work. As much as you would like to skip ahead to tech, it's really super important to understand how you're working right now, where the pain points are, what processes are in place, if any, and kind of understanding that first and allowing that to inform sort of your go forward plan, if you will. And look, the other part of it too is, contracting is a collaborative process. It should be thought of as a collaborative process, not as one that is just simply a matter of one function handling or another. And that's something that I really take to heart, and I would encourage all of you to take to heart as well. And that means reaching out to other people, including them in the conversation, and allowing them to have a voice in it. And that way you can feel like everyone's a part of it, everyone's buying into it. And that allows for, I think, a more cohesive, proactive, and ultimately productive and revenue generating contracting function.
Amazing. I think this has been super educational, super valuable. I've certainly come away with a lot of hope and optimism for how sales and legal can address these challenges moving forward. And like you said, Brian, address this as any other part of the conversion funnel where you're seeing how can you optimize, how can you remove friction out of that process, and how can you drive faster sales cycles. So with that, thank you guys very, very much. And please reach out to these folks if you have any further questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists and moderator. You are all fantastic. I definitely learned a lot today. Also, thanks to our lively audience. So many good questions. I'm sure you'll have a lot to discuss after this event. So lastly, this event has been recorded, so I will be compiling this recording and key takeaways to be available on our website shortly. But yeah, Malbec, we couldn't have done it without you. Thanks so much for your sponsorship, and stay safe, everyone. Have a great day.
All right, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.